to our lecture for tonight. So this is part one of our interview and interrogation module, if you will. And the reason I thought it was appropriate to start with this particular lecture is because we need to learn how to obtain information before we can actually start to conduct an interview or do an interrogation, which actually are two different things, and before we can start to write, because that's the big part of it. You have to be able to get your information, make sure it's accurate, etc., before you start writing your report. So that's why I really think this is an important part of tonight's lecture. And as I said before, I'll show you some different kind of tricks of the trade as we go through and look at different things. But there really is an art to interviewing and interrogating individuals. And again, those are two separate things. Interviewing is more, you basically interview a witness or a victim or a reporting party, as opposed to an interrogation is going to be focused or geared more towards someone who is a potential suspect. So those are the two different things. And then there are things that have to come along with that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what we want to take away from part one tonight is, the knowledge obtained through questioning and physical evidence is really important, because honestly, not every crime scene, not every investigation, you're going to have all of this cool evidence. There's a lot of times you have nothing other than maybe a witness, and you have no physical evidence. So you have to kind of use that skill set in order to obtain whatever the end of your investigation is. And I also hope that you can kind of learn that questioning can provide leads for finding physical evidence. So the better you are of asking questions, the better chance you have of obtaining good information that can lead you toward additional evidence, physical evidence. And then confessions must be supported by physical evidence. And would anybody really want to take a shot on why would a confession need to be supported by some type of other evidence?
It collaborates the person's story and it gives it more of the substance as to what really happened.
Right. I mean, because believe it or not, people confess to things that they didn't do. And there's some cases that we'll kind of take a look at down the line here, but just a mere confession isn't enough. It used to be many, many years ago, but now it's not, because we know we have these false confessors, etc. So the courts are looking for some type of other supporting evidence to go along with or corroborate what that particular person is telling you. So it really is super important that, you're able to kind of get both. So where do we get some of this information? And this is just kind of a general source of information. Well, in addition to physical evidence, and that's that's a big one, and this isn't a criminal investigation course, but when you write reports, you're going to have to document things like this. But in addition to physical evidence, there really are three primary sources of information that are available. The first would be what we kind of categorize as reports, records, and databases. And those are important because police reports are good records, other reports, any type of records, birth certificates, etc., databases. These are all good sources of information, especially when it comes to investigative follow-up. Another source of information would be people who are not suspects, but who know something about whatever happened. And that could be a victim, that could be a witness. It could even be a friend of the suspect. So they might know some information. So you have to kind of expand your mind when you're thinking about these sources of information. Where do I begin, and where do I kind of follow up with this? And then finally, you don't want to forget about the actual suspect in the crime, because they are an awesome source of information, providing if you're skilled enough to elicit some type of statement from them. And again, suspects fall into the category of interrogation. And as we'll find out in just a little bit, if you're going to interrogate somebody, then this case law called Miranda is going to kind of come into play. And we'll learn a little bit more about that as we kind of go through tonight's lecture. Okay, so reports, records, databases, just a little bit more. Local resources. An important information source, would be the records and reports of your local police department. That would include all preliminary reports, follow-ups, offense and arrest records, MO files, which would be modus operandi files, meaning, kind of the way that people do things, fingerprint files, gun registration, wanted bulletins. All of these things are really good local resources as it relates to information. And just this kind of slide alone should make you think, hey, you know what, this is a report writing class. So do you mean to say that other agencies are going to look at my report? The answer is going to be yes, because it could be a series of crimes that are taking place, and your report could actually be the link between the suspect and this string of crimes that are actually taking place. So, again, the accuracy of how you write and what you write is very, very important, because a lot of people are going to see that. Some database systems just to kind of think about, just to get your mind kind of moving a little bit, would be auto track systems. These are automatic inventory tracking systems. Very useful if businesses believe that their inventory shrinking or what have you. Caller ID. And again, this is just to kind of get you thinking. The phone number from which a call is placed can be recorded by a caller ID, even if the call isn't picked up. So these are all things that we can use. Did the person receive a phone call? Did they make a phone call? So good databases. The internet is great when it comes to locating information on individuals, etc., and your Facebook page. And a lot of you use Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all these other things that I don't quite understand as well. But we definitely know that people post a lot of things on social media, and that's another great database platform for you to get information. A couple of things that law enforcement will use, just so you're kind of aware, would be something called a PIN register. And these are electronic devices that record all numbers dialed from specific phone lines. There's something called a DNR, which is a dialed number recorder. And this can simultaneously monitor call activity on different lines, several lines at one time, kind of like wiretapping, if you will. And if you've never seen one of those, this is kind of what it looks like. This is a DNR, so this is a dialed number recorder. And of course, you would have to get a warrant to have this put on somebody's phone or computer, etc. But these are just systems that law enforcement might use in order to track an individual or get information. They come in different sizes, so you can just kind of take a look at it. So I just want to be able to kind of show you what I'm talking about. So this is another different kind of a dialed number recorder. All right, some other sources of information from the state or even from the feds. DMV. That's a great source of information because you might be trying to find an address, a new address, an old address, or what else can I get through DMV? How about a photo? So, yeah, so say that again.
Name changes?
Name changes, yes. So you've got name changes, you have vehicles registered to, you have photographs. So these are all, DMV really is a good connecting source for information. Department of Corrections, that's another really good one, especially if somebody has been incarcerated. Social Security, and then you have some other agencies a little bit higher up, but they're still great sources of info. You have the FBI, ATF, DEA, DHS. So you know the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If you don't know what the acronyms are, you have the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms You have Department of Homeland Security and the Drug Enforcement Agency. All of these are other federal agencies that can help you uh, with information gathering. As I said before, the internet is a huge valuable resource. You can really find a lot of people through the internet. You can even go, there are pay sites that you can go to, or just searching a lot of times you can find information on individuals. You'd really be surprised what you can find. Used in fast breaking cases like a kidnapping, the internet can really aid investigators to distribute all kinds of photos, etc. I mean, think about it now. Years and years ago, when I started, when there really wasn't kind of the internet to the level it is today, um, we couldn't do what we can do now. Now, if we have a missing person, a critical missing, a kidnapping, a robbery suspect, and we can get no leads, we'll post it on our police department Facebook. And you'd be surprised the amount of hits or responses that we get back maybe on who this person might be or where they might be. So it really is becoming a little bit more, I mean, it's you have to be careful with a lot of the information, but it does help you and aid in your information. So the internet is another really good source. Okay, so kind of focusing now away from the databases, but talking about victims, complainants. Those are typically the reporting parties a lot of times, and witnesses. So in addition to those things we talked about, reports, records, databases, internet resources, investigators obtain information from people associated with the investigation. And who might those be? Well, they would be the victim. They're a good source of information. And the victim, by definition, is the person that they use the word injured, but it means they're the ones that the crime is committed against. It doesn't have to be an actual injury. Okay, so that's a victim. The complainant could be the person who requests some type of action. So the reporting party. Sometimes the victim is the reporting party. Sometimes it's a neighbor. An example would be you could be in your home or in your apartment and you hear yelling, screaming next door in the apartment next door, banging, clashing, whatever, and a gunshot. So you're not the victim, but you might be the reporting party when you notify law enforcement, hey, this is what I'm hearing. So they're important because that law enforcement will talk to you about what you heard, what you saw, etc. And then of course there's the witness. And this is a person who saw the crime or at least some part of the crime. All right. And then finally, we'll get to the suspect in a minute. Kind of going along with victims and witnesses, etc. There's something called a neighborhood canvass. And one of the best ways to solve a crime is to go door to door in the area of a crime scene looking for witnesses. Okay, and it's called an area canvas, and really this is one of the first things that an investigator should have on their list of things to do. And when done correctly, you can really get a lot of good information by going door to door. So that's typically called a neighborhood canvas. And this is just a couple of photos. When you talk about different crimes, etc., whether it's a manhunt for a homicide suspect, or a gang shooting or what have you, law enforcement will go yard to yard, door to door, not necessarily just looking for the suspect, which they could be, but they're also looking to contact individuals that might have seen something or might have heard something. So, a really important thing would be that neighborhood canvas. We also have something called a knock and talk. And this is a practice that's used to obtain information from others. And a lot of times we use this knock and talk at a location that we believe that the suspect might be at. And so as I kind of have right here, it usually takes place at a suspect's or witness's house and generally considered a consensual encounter. And basically what we do is we knock on the door and we talk to them about, hey, We believe that someone was involved in this type of crime. We believe that maybe they might know you through whatever, and we basically just try to talk our way into the residence. It's legal. It's under a case United States versus Crasper, and you don't have to know the case. It's a legal thing that law enforcement is allowed to do, but it has to be consensual. So if the person tells us, hey, you can't come in, we can't come in. Okay, so this is more of a consensual type thing. So a lot of different things that we can do. We do have to keep in mind, though, that suspect statements, witness statements, etc., they're not always reliable. Okay, witnesses are more confident in their knowledge of what happened than they are accurate, and we've learned this over the years. And again, one of the number one causes of false imprisonment cases really is witness identification. It's not the law enforcement officer's report. It's not that they lied, etc. They didn't collude. They didn't do any things like that. It's a bad ID by a particular witness, and it does. And the witnesses, they truly believe that they saw what they saw. They're not making it up, etc. But a lot of times they're not quite accurate in their assessment. And then kind of adding to that ambiguity is the fact that many people only see part of a crime, but they testify that they saw the entire thing. Anybody want to take a kind of a guess on why somebody would do that? Why would someone say they saw the whole thing? Let's take a
I
shot.
believe I believe it's in part that their mind is making up this story as it goes along to fit what they saw.
Okay, and that's a really good answer. And part of it is that you're right. They try to take the puzzle pieces and they try to build the case in their brain while they're there and saying, yeah, that fits, that fits. So it must have happened this way. So yeah, that's one other thing. And then sometimes people just want to be helpful. They want to be helpful, and this is where your skill as an investigator and interviewer comes into play. And a simple example could be, you never lead a witness when you ask them a question. So when you ask somebody, was the witness wearing a black, or was the suspect wearing a black jacket? What's wrong with that statement?
It
You're
puts
giving them a color.
Yeah, I just gave him the color. So it's easy for someone to go, oh yeah, sure. Yeah, it was dark. Must have been black. Instead of what color, what kind of clothing were they wearing? So you can start broad and then kind of move in a little bit. So you don't want to give them that information. So we do have to be very careful that we don't lead them when we talk of different things. And then another really great source of information, although there's just a lot of issues with it, would be what we call informants. And, you know, real of importance to investigators is what we call a confidential informant. And this is someone that is basically formally registered. And this is kind of the rub that kind of gets a lot of people. A lot of times these informants, if they're formally registered, they're compensated by a police agency for giving information. And compensation means money. So we use a lot of informants for drug cases because we can't, as law enforcement, we can't go into a drug house and buy narcotics in our uniform. So a lot of times we'll get informants to go in there and do it for us, but you're paying them. So you have to kind of be careful. And this compensation can be money. Typically it's money, but they could be working off a case or different things. But we do have to understand that informants, they have a reason for doing what they're doing, whether it's money, whether it's to work off a case, or whether it's to reduce the number of cases. So maybe we've arrested somebody for possession of, let's say, methamphetamine, and he's got 4 cases on him. He may go in and do a drug buy for us if we get rid of 2 of the cases. So it has its benefits, but we also know that we have to be very careful with using an informant because there's different reasons for them wanting to do what they do. So
What do
just
you mean to work off a case?
work off a case could mean, so let's say that I stop you driving away from a drug house, and during a contact with you and a subsequent search, I find some drugs on you and I arrest you for that. And when I get you to the station, I read you your rights, and you say that you're gonna go. You don't have a problem talking to me about it, and you may say, "Hey, Farrar, you know what? Um, I know the name of the guy that's selling the drugs there. If you can talk to the DA and get me a deal, I'll go in and buy dope for you." Which means if they go in and buy narcotics, we can do a search warrant off of that, go in, arrest the seller, etc. That's called working off a case. Does that kind of make sense? Well, I hope it does.
Yes, it does.
Okay. All right. All right. So, um, you know, talking a little bit more about informants. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but developing informants is a really big deal. Um, a lot of times, again, they're registered with your organization, which means they fill out paperwork. You work with the district attorney, and they know what the informant knows what they have to do, and you know what you have to do, etc. But we just have to be careful when we deal with informants. Um, I'm going to skip past the reliability portion and go to the suspect. So the last source of information before we really start talking about how to do an interview, etc., would be the suspect. And they are full of information, but you have to be able to talk to them in a manner to elicit that information. So, who is a suspect? Well, this is somebody that is directly or indirectly connected with a crime, either by the overt act, which means participating, or by planning, or by directing. So it could be two or three people working together. One's the getaway driver, the other one goes into the store, and one's a lookout. I mean, so they all have a stake in this. So they're all basically connected, so they would be considered suspects. Don't overlook the suspect as a chief source of information because they're involved in the crime. And your job, again, is going to be basically figuring out, how do I interrogate this person in a manner that they're going to be willing to give me information to help corroborate my case. And an individual can become a suspect either through information by citizens or by their own actions. So, a suspect really is someone that we don't want to forget. A little bit more on suspects. A person with a known MO, which is a modus operandi fitting a crime, may be spotted at or near a crime scene. When questioning occurs spontaneously on the street, it's really advantageous for officers to question someone suspected in a crime right after it's happened. And the reason I put that in there is we have these little things right here called field interview cards. And this technically is a report in a sense, and they get filed in a big file cabinet. A lot of them are electronic now, where they'll take the data from the card and put it into a computer. But if we stop someone on the street and we don't have enough to really arrest them for a particular crime, let's say it was a suspicious person call, we fill out this card, and you can see it's got their, room for their name, their driver's license, information on where they live, etc. If they're involved in gangs, what kind of they were doing. Were they prowling? Were they a witness to something? Are they in a gang? Were they in a vehicle? And these are important because a lot of times you may not catch the person, or you may stop them before they commit the crime, and you really don't have enough to arrest them because they haven't committed the crime yet, if that makes sense. So after that crime happens, you can go back and you can run this database of field interview cards, and you might be able to find a match on your suspect wearing the same clothing or having the same type of tattoo, or something like that. So field interview cards are super important. Okay, so now we're going to move. Any questions on like just that little part that I covered as it relates to some methods to get information? And if there are none, we're going to kind of slip now into the interviewing and interrogating phase. And again, this is just part one, and we'll do part two. But, as kind of an overview, information is obtained continuously throughout an investigation, which means that if you work a homicide case, it may take you a week, not all at one time, basically, but you may come in for 8 hours one day, 10 hours the next day, and information is just going to keep coming in. Sometimes this information is volunteered to you, and sometimes you have to work for it. Okay. And when we talk about interviewing and interrogation, by definition, just so you know, an interview, it's this person is not a suspect, but you believe that they know something. It could be a witness, it could be a victim, it could be a friend of the suspect, etc. As opposed to an interrogation, this is where you suspect this person of direct or indirect involvement. Two different methods of the way that you're going to handle these people. An interview is probably going to be you're going to be polite in all of them anyway, but you're not really digging down and being accusatory, if that kind of makes sense with an interview. You're just trying to elicit information. Probably one of the best cases out there. All right, and if the link doesn't work, let me know and I'll send it out. This is one of the best suspect interviews I think I have ever witnessed. This guy here, Colonel Russell Williams, as you can see, was a commander in the Canadian Air Force, and he was also a rapist, burglar, and murder suspect. He ended up killing 2 or 3 people, raping a bunch of women, taking trophies from their house, which means like underwear, filming the whole thing. It just and his supposedly his spouse didn't know about it, which we could debate that all day. But if you want to watch a great interview, this would be a really good interview to watch. And this is just some of the kind of evidence that they had against him. He actually wore the boots that he wore at some of the crime scenes into the interview, and some of the tire tracks on his car. But a really good interview for you to watch if you're interested in interview and interrogation. And I think you'll be really amazed at the job that this guy does. All right, so what then are some characteristics of an effective interviewer or interrogator? Well, you have to be skillful, which means that you have to be adaptable and basically culturally adroit or skillful. You have to understand that people are different and not all people react the same way to certain things. It's not like on TV where you can go in there and just yell and scream, because honestly, just like with anything else, that's not always the approach to take. Okay? You have to be self-controlled and patient. You're not going to get a confession in 3 minutes. It's not going to happen like that. Maybe you'll get lucky, but you have to be under control and super patient. You have to be confident, optimistic. You need to be objective. What does objective mean? This is probably one of the more important characteristics. What does it mean to be objective?
It means you don't yet have your conclusions drawn.
Yeah, you have to go into it with an open mind. Because sometimes you get fooled. If you start focusing on just one thing, you're not going to ask the right questions. You're not going to look at the facts. You're going to kind of just think, hey, this person is the person, and you could be wrong. So you really want to be super objective. You have to understand and be sensitive to people's rights. They do have the right not to talk to you. And you need to draw the line. If they don't want to talk to you, then they don't have to talk to you. If they want to, then great. You also need to understand the elements of the crime that you're investigating. Because if you don't understand the elements, you're not going to be able to prove it. So you have to know what makes up a robbery, or what makes up a burglary, what makes up an assault. And so again, you really have to, so there's a lot to know. And these are kind of the bigger, broader characteristics of someone that is super effective as it relates to investigating and interrogating. Understand that successful questioning requires two-way communication. It's not just you talking all the time. Okay, so this is the communication between the investigator and the person that's being questioned. So, what are some ways you might prepare or do prior to or during an interview to make a person being questioned more talkative? What might you do? Let's kind of throw it out there. What are some things that you could do?
So what
You could
I've been
ask like, oh wait, you can.
Honestly,
sorry,
into
sorry, what I've been told is that a good way to get people to start talking is to remain quiet. It makes it awkward and they want to fill that void.
Okay, sometimes being quiet, the other person may want to strike up the conversation or at least start saying something. Okay, anything else? What else?
try to
You could
relate to
just
them, try to talk to them, and see how they're dressed, or try to have a general background on them, and try to relate to that.
Okay, that could be it. I mean, maybe if you knew something a little bit about them, if you had some background info, you could talk about something. Sure. Anything else?
you could honestly just start talking about random things, like how someone's day might be going.
You could be. You could start right at the, yeah, right there and just kind of say, hey, how's your day? I mean, it's probably not going to be great if they're being interrogated, but you're right. I mean, so it could be low level. Um, just to kind of throw it out there before we move on, if you were interviewing, well, let's switch it. If you were interrogating a child molester, a male, how would you talk to them? What would your tone of voice be?
Probably want to try and be as calm as possible, or even try to make your voice like more childlike.
Okay, that's good. So these are all things. So yeah, for a male suspect, typically, I mean, you're not going to, the screaming and yelling part won't work. Okay, so you really want to be you're kind of a softer voice, an understanding voice, but in the back of your mind, I know it's kind of disgusting, and you're thinking, ooh, I have to kind of be like this. Maybe you sit a little closer to the person, and it kind of weirds you out. But remember, you have to know who you're interviewing too. So yeah, so these are all things that you're going to kind of learn, but understanding how to get people to talk to you. And on the other side, on the flip side, people have reasons for not wanting to talk to you, right? I mean, and there probably are some that are in here. They might not seem logical a lot of times, but you have to be aware of barriers. We really know that. Sometimes people just don't want to be a snitch. And that could be in some of the gang neighborhoods, some of the drug neighborhoods, or even neighbors. They don't want to snitch on their neighbor or be the rat or what have you. And even though it might be doing the right thing to tell, maybe they just don't want to be that person. There could be some prejudice involved. Could people be afraid to talk to the police? The answer is yes. And a lot of people I know, they say, and I probably was like this when I was a super younger cop. Hey, if you didn't do anything wrong, what's the big deal? Just tell. It doesn't always work like that. Okay. A lot of times, some people grew up in areas that maybe they didn't trust law enforcement. So you may have to bridge that gap, and to get somebody to trust you. There could be a language barrier, and that happens a lot where you just can't connect with someone because of language. Could be that the person is hearing impaired. There's just a lot of different reasons that people don't want to talk to you. So it's up to you to kind of understand, hey, there are some barriers, and how do I get past these barriers? And there are ways that you can get past it. You could get, if there's a language thing, you could get an interpreter, a translator. If someone's hearing impaired, you could get a translator that signs. There are plenty of different ways to do this, but you just have to understand what some of the barriers are. Some of the big requirements, though, there really are two basic requirements. And this not only applies to interview and interrogation, it totally applies if you're married. Okay. And I've been married like 30 years, so I can spit that out there and say that. But listen, and guys, sorry, I'm just going to kind of throw us down for a second. We tend not to listen very well. We would rather kind of try to fix things because that's how guys kind of operate, I guess. But good requirements for interviewing, asking questions, etc., would be to listen and to observe. And the reason I put observe in there is because how people act during questioning can tell you just as much or more than what they say. Everybody's probably heard of the phrase body language, right? And that really can tip you off to tell you whether or not, or at least to alert you to whether or not somebody's telling the truth. And you've all seen it, right? The person that's bored, kind of does. Are you going to interview somebody kind of like this? When you kind of know that they're bored, or people that are nervous, they do different things. Ladies are kind of twirl their hair. Guys will kind of do this with their hands. If people are constantly doing, these are just little clues. It doesn't mean they're guilty, but it can help you when you really start to understand people's, not just their facial cues, but also their body language. When people do this, I don't know if you can see me, I'll probably try to stand up, but if they put their arms up like this, that really kind of means that they're not listening to you, or they really don't want to listen to you. So just little things like that, these little nonverbal things are super important for us to understand. Okay, so now we're going to kind of look at some different techniques as it relates to questioning, the different types. So typically there's several different types of questions by definition, but we're going to look at a couple. We're going to look at direct, indirect, closed-ended, open-ended, and then what we call leading. Okay, so these are some of the types of questions that we're going to look. So a direct question would be one that's very to the point. Kind of fits right in there, direct, right there, right to the point, right? It really doesn't allow, there's not a lot of misinterpretation in there with a direct question. So, and I'll give you some examples as we kind of go through. So it could be a direct question, could be, what time did you leave leave for the restaurant? There's not a lot of wiggle room in there. So that could be an example of a direct question. I'm asking for something very, very specific. Okay. An indirect question, a little bit different. It's a little more polite way to ask questions, if you will, because it's meant to elicit a variety of responses. We want a little bit more information, not just like a 1-word or a 2-word answer. So it could be something like, how do you and your neighbor get along? And that's pretty broad, right? It's open. There's a lot of, a lot of things could be said that kind of fills in there. So the person's gonna give you more information than just a direct question, a yes or no, or a time, or something like that. So that's an indirect. We have a closed-ended question. And this one is typically yes or no. You're not asking for anything else. It's yes, it's no. It makes it pretty simple, or a short response, but typically it goes with yes or no. Do you get along with your neighbor? Yes or no. So that it kind of makes it simple. And, did you go straight home after work? Yes, no. And if they say no, then you could follow up with another question, but these are very closed-ended. And then open-ended, again, these are made to elicit a more kind of a detailed response, a little bit longer, right? Kind of insight into the person's knowledge or feelings. And these are typically questions that are like why, how, or tell me about. So could be, what can you tell me about your relationship with your neighbor? And you can see that that's just super wide open. They're going to tell you all kinds of different things. So these are some different types of questions that you ask people. And then finally, we have the leading question. And this would be one that basically prompts or leads a person to a specific response and often kind of implies an answer. And I kind of gave you an example of that. The example I put here, how much did you have to drink before you went to the job site and assaulted your boss? Well, I mean, you kind of gave it away there. You already asked them about the drinking, but it could be the example I gave about the black jacket. Was the suspect wearing a black jacket? And you kind of gave them, you led them with the question. So hopefully these different types of questions kind of make sense. As it relates to questioning techniques, additional things that law enforcement typically does would be recording and videotaping interviews and interrogations. And many law enforcement agencies across the nation have implemented policies on digital video or audio recordings for witnesses, victims, and suspects. So as we're kind of finishing up with this one piece here, why would we record this? What's the reason for videotaping or recording somebody's statements?
To make sure they're not lying. So someone might give you one statement and then say another.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times people can change their statements. Any other reason? That's good.
To use them against them in court in case they contradict their statements.
So very good. We can bring that to court. So if they back out or kind of change their statement, we can actually play the statement in court, the recording, and it helps defeat that. There's another thing I'm also looking for. What else?
Accuracy to keep both sides accountable.
Okay. So yeah, I think I kind of know where you're going. So when you talk about accountable, do you mean like if the person accuses the officer of being overzealous or something like that?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, so I mean, this way the person, the person that's being interrogated can't say, well, the officer intimidated me, or he forced me to do this, or he threatened me, or she threatened me, and it kind of goes both ways. You can even, I mean, another good thing about videotaping, especially, would be the body language of the suspect that you're interrogating. Whether they start to break down or cry or whatever it is. So having all of this in there is really, really important. So recording and videotaping, it typically, it's kind of the natural thing that law enforcement does now. I don't know any department that really doesn't videotape or at least audio record any type of interview. And one other thing that comes into play, and I just kind of threw it down here, the case of Miranda versus Arizona, just note that, and we'll kind of catch up to this in our second half of the lecture, that if you're going to interrogate someone that is in custody, you're going to have to read that person what they call their Miranda rights. And that's kind of a Fifth Amendment thing because they have the right not to incriminate themselves. Therefore, if they don't want to talk to you and they would like an attorney, they can assert that right at the time when you read them their rights. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Couple of photos of just different interview rooms. A lot of times interviews are monitored. So, I mean, this is kind of an older system up here in the upper right corner. A lot of times the interview rooms, they're different shapes and different sizes. They're not meant to be super pleasant as far as photos on the wall. They're very plain, very simple. Again, sometimes we'll have somebody monitoring an interview, which is totally fine. We can do that. And then kind of the newest thing that's out there, if you look at the bottom left here, would be body cameras. That's a really big deal. Most law enforcement agencies have them, and if not, they're really working towards getting those. And having a body camera is really good because it does diffuse a lot of things and can help the officer later on in court if they're accused of doing something wrong, etc. Here's a couple of different photos of just some interview rooms so you can see some different types. Again, they're very plain. They're not meant to have a lot of aesthetic, pleasing aesthetics in there, etc. A lot of times they're soundproof. There's typically a window built in so that way people can see in if they need to, just in case something happens, etc. Sometimes they'll have a two-way glass mirror, and most people might know this, but you can't see out, but they can see in, so people can stand on the other side, other investigators, to watch the body language of an individual. A lot of times, again, super plain, but they'll have restraint areas. Sometimes you can uncuff somebody if you're going to do an interrogation if you believe it's safe to do so, or you can leave that person secured. It just kind of depends on your policy, etc. This is kind of a larger interview room. Typically, we don't see them kind of this big, but again, it's different from place to place. And you can see that you have an investigator kind of on both sides, and you have this person kind of stuck into the corner. There is a strategy when it comes to, where you're going to place the person that you're going to interview or that you're going to interrogate. Okay, so just kind of an overview of the interview, and we'll kind of wrap up part one. You want to establish, the priority of obtaining statements. Remember your main sources of information, the person that maybe heard the crime or reported it, the victim, and the witness. In most cases, you want to interview that reporting party or that complainant first. Then you want to, talk to the witness. Then you want to talk to, the eyewitness, and then the suspect last, if you have your suspect in custody. And the reason for that is you want to get all the information first, right, before you sit down with your suspect, so you know what you have to deal with. And that should make sense to everybody. After you talk to the victim and the witness, now you know what you have, what questions to ask of the suspect, etc. That's why you don't want to talk to your suspect first. And you want to record both positive and negative information. That's important. You don't just write down part of what somebody says, you write down all of it. And you finally want to separate witnesses. Does anybody understand or know why you want to separate witnesses? Why would we do that? Why would we have them in different rooms?
So they don't try to make their own story fit each other's story?
Yeah, and that's good. And Scott, you're right. A lot of people, they'll start to compare. Do you think it was black? No, I thought it was dark gray. Maybe you're right. Okay, dark gray. And then they start to change things, and you don't want that. You want everybody's story to just be whatever facts you get from them. So we're not trying to be mean or anything, but it is important that you separate people so that way you're just getting factual information and you're not allowing them to talk and kind of create a story. When you talk about interviewing, think about it, a little advanced planning. Read the reports about the case before you interview somebody. Know what questions that you want to have, that you want to ask. A lot of investigators, they write the questions down before they even go into an interview. So that way they don't forget what question to ask. So that's really important. Kind of anticipate, if you can, how somebody might respond. Select a time and a place for your interview. We know that witnesses, it's best to interview them as quickly as possible because things are fresh in their mind. You don't want to wait 2 weeks and go back to somebody if you don't have to, because people don't remember that far back sometimes. Sometimes they can, but a lot of times they may not. So you want to make sure that if you're going to interview somebody at a crime scene, make sure the scene is safe. Figure out, who is who's the RP, the eyewitness, the witness, etc. and you can do the interview there. If it's a kind of a heavy duty crime, you may want to take the witness back to the station and have them on video as well, not just your suspect. You may want to get everybody on video, so that's important. As far as your interview goes itself, be friendly, be professional, make sure they know that you're the investigator. And you know, you can ask some general questions at first, but then you're going to start to kind of focus in. You want to establish rapport with whoever you're talking to. So be understanding, listen, okay? You know, you want to kind of enhance that rapport, which is the understanding between people, you know, kind of seem interested, even though maybe you're not interested, but it's a crime. So you really want to kind of establish a rapport with somebody the best you can, so that way they'll talk to you. When you know, if you deal with reluctant interviewees, people that really don't want to talk to you, you can give them some self-assurance, just reassure them, you know, whatever their issue might be. Kind of take a logical approach. There is such, you know, something called an emotional approach. But again, every case is just a little bit different. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the cognitive interview. I'm going to kind of go through this part right here. Okay, so I talked earlier about, and we're just about done with part one, when you do an interrogation versus an interview, because remember, these are two different things. And I will get to somebody's question in the chat in just a second. Before interrogating any suspect that's in custody, you have to give them a Miranda warning. So an easy way to remember this: custody, interrogation equals Miranda. Okay. And okay, so Marcy, I see your question here. How do you know when question preparation doesn't cross over into subjective thought? And that's a really good question. A lot of times, though, you're just basing your questions on factual information or information that can corroborate your case. So sometimes, you know, not every question you ask is going to be a perfect question. But again, the reason that law enforcement officers might write out their questions first is because, have you ever like gone to the store and you've done all your shopping and you get home and you forgot something? It's probably happened to a lot of you. It happens to me like all the time. It's no different when you're questioning someone, where if you're just going to ask questions off the fly without writing them down first, chances are you're going to miss out on a lot of good questions. So that's why you want to read those reports, talk to all your witnesses, etc., before you talk to your suspect, and then you're going to want to write those questions out so you know exactly what questions you're going to ask, so you don't miss any. Note that Miranda doesn't apply to what we call voluntary statements or spontaneous statements. Okay. And Miranda warnings are not required during an ID procedure. So like if I'm taking your fingerprints, I don't have to read you your rights. Okay. If I'm doing a lineup, I don't have to read you your rights. Okay. But if you're in custody and I'm going to talk to you directly about this crime, then I'm going to have to read you your rights. So custody, interrogation equals Miranda. Okay. Understand that a suspect can waive the rights granted by Miranda, but they have to do so intelligently and knowingly, which means they have to know that they're giving up their rights. So if you ask them, if you read them their rights, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford to hire one, one will be appointed to represent you free of charge. Do you understand the rights I've explained to you? And the person doesn't respond. He says nothing. And then you just kind of go ahead and go, okay, well, what about this? Silence is not a waiver. They have to tell you that they're waiving their rights. Just because they're quiet, that's not a yes and it's not a no. So the court really says, hey, we need to know that this person intelligently and knowingly gave up their right to an attorney. Okay. And if you've never seen what a Miranda card looks like, Here's one right here. And just kind of a little food for thought here. Why do you think we have it, the Miranda warning on a card? Why do you this is an actual card that I used to carry with me.
It's so that you can say it word for word and not get it mixed up or have it used against you during testimony and trial.
Yeah, so that's good. So, and it's really big because when you go, the first time you testify in court, you guys, I'm not kidding, you're going to be a little nervous. And when you get up there and, the attorney, the defense attorney says, Officer Farrar, did you advise my client of the Miranda rights? And you stick your chest out and you go, yes, I did, sir. And then the next thing the attorney says is, well, what were those rights that you said that you read to my client? And then you're thinking to yourself, dang, man. I mean, I can recite them now because I've done it so many times, but here, what you write in your report is, I advise suspect Dale of his Miranda rights per a pre-printed Miranda card. And this is in my top pocket of my uniform. And I'll pull it out. And then the attorney really doesn't have anything to say because here's the card. And if they want me to read it, fine. I'll turn the card over and I'll read it because I do the same thing every single time. So that kind of makes sense. So good answer on knowing that. Okay. So let me just kind of slide through here. A lot of this is from a kind of a class that goes a little bit more into super detail. So we really don't have to go through too much to everything here. Let's see. Be careful of deception when it comes to interrogating. Law enforcement, we are able to use some deception. We can't plant evidence, of course, and things like that, but we can do things like, hey, your partner already basically ratted you out and said that you did it. So I mean, we can use a little bit of deception, but we have to be very, very careful. Okay, when we do that. I'll tell you about a case that I worked a little while ago. As soon as we finish this part, of course, we don't do this interrogations. We can't use any physical force, right? You can't waterboard somebody. You can't use tactics like the movie Taken, which is like the greatest scene ever in a movie. And hook them up to a battery and zap them or whatever. That would be great, but you can't do that. So we kind of go through. All right, and then the last thing to finish up would be polygraphs. So we know that there's a lot of different technology and scientific evidence and things like that as it relates to physical evidence, and there's something called a polygraph. And a polygraph basically measures respiration, the depth of your breathing, the skin's electrical resistance, your blood pressure, and your pulse. And has anyone taken a polygraph out there? It's a little bit scary. It's
I have.
okay. Yeah. So I see somebody, a lie detector. Yeah. Same thing. So a polygraph, it's kind of tense. They put something around your finger, and they put kind of a thing around your upper chest, your middle, and your lower. And you get kind of tense because you're looking at the person over there at the computer, or they're writing, they're scratching stuff down, and they ask you questions and things like that. And it can be very nerve-wracking to take a polygraph. Polygraphs are only legal in one state to use in court, and it's actually a military court. New Mexico. California, you can use a polygraph for investigative purposes, but it won't stand up to the measure of pure scientific evidence at trial. So you can only use it as an investigative tool. You can't use it at trial. It's something that won't be accepted at trial. But a lot of times we'll have somebody do a polygraph. And I'm not going to go into the use of psychics and profilers and things like that. These are just some different things that we've used before. Okay, so I want to finish with a really quick story when we talk about ethics. We'll take a break and then we'll kind of come back. So A case that I worked in my previous agency, we had a series of residential or commercial burglaries, basically restaurants, if you will. And the suspects involved would break in. Not only would they eat food and take things, little machinery items, money, cash, anything that they can kind of take out. And for the longest time, we couldn't catch this individual or these people. And one day, I was at my desk in my office and I received a tip, and it was a phone message that was forwarded. And basically, the message just said, "Hey, the person that's doing this is this guy right here." And he gives a name and hangs up. So all I have is a name. So I figure, okay, it's better than nothing. And I run the person's name, and he comes back with, he's local in the area where all these burglaries are happening. So he lives in the area, or at least his last known address was there. And he has a history of burglary. He has a couple of arrests and a couple convictions for burglary. So I'm thinking this is a good place to start, but I really don't have a lot. So we set up on this person's house and we start to surveil him. And we do it for about 4 or 5 days, and we get absolutely nothing. He doesn't do anything. We've watched him. We're watching him 24 hours a day for like 4 or 5 days. He does absolutely nothing. And finally, I decide, you know what? I'm going to try something a little bit different. So I go to our computer system and I run his name and I print out his driver's license information. And if you've ever seen a printout of your license, it's got your name, your address, your height, your weight, your driver's license number, all that kind of stuff like that. Vehicles registered to. And so I went into the fingerprint room and I took my thumb and rolled it in ink and rolled my fingerprint on that piece of paper. So now I have his printout with a thumbprint on it. And I figure, okay, so we do a knock and talk. Remember I talked about that knock and talk thing. We walked up to his place and we knocked on the door, and he answers the door. And I say, "Hey, I'm Officer so-and-so. I'm investigating a series of burglaries in the neighborhood. And I'm just kind of going house to house to see if anybody knows anything or has heard anything or has any information at all." And he's like, "Well, no, I really don't know anything. So I'm really sorry I can't help you." And so I start to talk to him a little bit more, and I say, "Well, have you frequented any of these places?" And I give him like 4 or 5 different restaurants in the area. And he tells me, "Nope, I've never been to any of those places. I've never gone in there, never purchased food. I really don't know anything. So I'm really sorry I can't help you." Does anybody know what I did next? You're going to love it. So I take the piece of paper out of my folder that has his information on it and my thumbprint, and I hold it up in front of him and I say, "Are you sure you've never been inside any of these buildings before? Because it's really funny. I found one of your fingerprints in one of these businesses that was burglarized. And isn't this your information here that matched this fingerprint?" And he kind of looked really stunned for a minute, and he started to sweat and get kind of nervous. And basically right there, he said, "Well, maybe I go, "Come on, man. They just want their property back." And so he confessed to me that he had done the burglaries, and we found pretty much all the stuff in his house. Now, let me ask you a question. Did I lie?
You were deceitful.
Well, okay. I was, but let's go a little further. Did I lie to him?
When you mentioned that you had one of his fingerprints at the scene, that was a lie.
Yes, it was.
But you
And
lied, but it's fine.
keep going.
It doesn't matter if you've got the response you needed, and you're not the one under investigation.
Okay. So the issue comes down to when I wrote my report and when I went to testify in court, what did I have to do? I had to write in my report. Did I have to write in my report that I lied to him and I used this deceptive tactic? Absolutely. I see people shaking their heads. Yes, you are absolutely right. When I testified in court in front of a jury, which actually was pretty funny, did I have to tell them that I was deceptive in what I did? Absolutely, I did. And at the end of the whole thing, I had to admit I got a couple of chuckles out of the jury on it. But at the end of the day, I didn't I didn't plant evidence on him, in his house or say I found something in there. I used a little bit of a deceitful tactic outside of his house. He wasn't in custody, so I didn't have to Mirandize him, but I did kind of trick him into believing that that was his fingerprint. So sometimes there's kind of a fine line there, and you just have to be very careful about that line. But hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit. If he would have been at the station in custody and I wanted to interrogate it, I would have had to have read him his rights, and I may not have got the same kind of statement from him that I got because he may not have told me anything. So everything was fine. He ended up getting convicted. But I had to write it all out in my report. So I had to be very detailed and honest about the trickery that I used. And it was a lie if you really about the fingerprint part, because it was my print. But I hope that kind of makes sense. And I hope that this first half of this lecture here, you kind of took some good information on where we get our information from, how we get it, and really how it applies to what you're going to write. So when we come back, I think we'll take let's take about maybe a 5-minute break. We'll come back in like 5 minutes and we'll jump into part 2, and we're going to kind of look at some of the legal aspects of interview and interrogation to kind of finish out our lecture part for tonight. So let's take about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll jump back into part 2.